everybody, my name is Spammals and welcome back to Sherlock Holmes and the case of the Mummy's Curse. This is the second of 3 vintage Sherlock Holmes cases that we're going to be playing on what I like to call Sherlock Sundays. If you happen to be new to this particular game, it's particularly old, made back in 1991. It definitely shows its age, but by no means does it make it any less fun to play. With a fresh mystery ahead of us, it's going to be a long one, so if that's not your jam, jog on, but if it is, get some popcorn, get back into bed, and without any more stalling, let's begin! With a lantern-lit sitting room at 221B Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes slowly takes a pull from his pipe, while Dr. Watson, reclining after a bit of tea, peruses a discarded copy of the London Times.
What rubbish! What balderdash!
You must have read something terribly disturbing, Watson, for you to be so overwrought this early in the morning.
Indeed, Holmes. It's irresponsible of the Times to play upon people's superstitions.
Ah, you must be referring to the affair of the Mummy's Curse.
Has the entire city in an uproar. 3 men dead, and they expect us to believe that a 4,000-year-old mummy was the murderer. I'm surprised you haven't taken some interest in this case, Holmes.
To the contrary, my dear Watson. I have made some inquiries. Because I dare say I do believe this murderer is a much younger chap.
Balderdash! Okay, we have a game! We have a mission! Right, so we don't have a great deal to go on right now. 3 people have been killed, and so far it's been blamed on this mystifying mummy. That's all we really know. And balderdash, damn it! And before we get into the thick of the business, let me show you how this game is going to be played. We've got 3 tools to our advantage, and we have the judge where the whole game comes to a close. Got a notepad. All the clues that we pick up throughout our investigation are going to be right here. If we happen to get stuck, we can speak to Mr. Watson and he can give us his, what I suppose is, guesses. Next up, we have the directory. Here is a literal phone book of every single name that we will ever be considered to call upon in the world of this game. And last but by no means least, we have the newspapers. Always a daily tabloid of gossip and information about the ongoings of the London peoples. This is the bit I hate the most. We kind of put up with it. Right, so the only clue we have to go on right now is, well, Watson was reading the Times. That's who he said. How dare they, the Times, blah, blah, blah. 3 people dead, 4,000-year-old mummy is our current suspect. We can go to the Times, see what their sources are for the story. After that, we could go speak to Inspector Lestrade, or Lestrade, and see what he has to say about the whole situation. About newspapers, London Times, here we go. Watson hails a carriage as he and Holmes proceeds to the offices of the London Times. Surely Henry, as the editor of the Times, would have some interesting news regarding this case.
It's quite amusing, all this hoopla over a mummy's curse, I must say. Not so amusing, of course, the murder of 3 Englishmen.
Have any of your reporters uncovered anything new?
Actually, I've been in Paris the past several weeks. Just returned to London on Tuesday. I've had no involvement with the writing of any of these articles. I believe they are all the work of Philip Travis. He's one of our young reporters. For a short time, he was the Egyptian correspondent.
Was he sacked?
No. He returned to London just a few days ago. I gather he was reassigned to cover the case from here because he had some familiarity with a murder in Egypt.
Do you know Travis?
No, never actually met the chap, although I hear he's a bit of an odd duck.
Thanks for your help, Henry.
Anytime. Let me know when you catch the mummy. That's one scoop I'd like to get.
Hey, that guy right there. Right, we didn't get too much out of him. He was out the country, knows nothing really to do with this article, this report, the people reporting it, but we did get a name, a Philip Travis. He's the guy behind this article because he knows a thing or two about mummies. He's also a bit of an oddball, so that could be fun. Right, before we get to him, let's go to Lestrade. Although talking with Lestrade is often tedious and the inspector is condescending, Holmes and Watson visit Scotland Yard, hoping the man has done his due diligence in this case and can offer insight.
Well, if it isn't Mr. Sherlock Holmes, London's most overly praised amateur sleuth, needing the help of the Yard again.
Are you going to stand for that, Holmes?
Let's just see who proceeds to solve this case, Watson. Inspector Lestrade, my good man, I'm looking into the cause of James Windibank's death.
I should have known. That murder has brought out every crank in the city. I think the professional police can wrap this one up.
All the same, could you tell us what you've discovered to date?
1 dead archaeologist, no suspect, no motive.
And what of Andrew Weatherby's death? Have you looked into that?
I have talked to Captain Ramsey, but we have no leads. Look, I'm not even sure that Weatherby's murder falls into our jurisdiction. And if it doesn't, you're not going to find me worrying about it. As it is, I have enough murders to take care of.
Well, as useful as the Strat often is, we did get some names out of that. If you're wondering why I'm looking over here, I'm actually keeping Wabash, a notepad, because I find it really helps with these games. So he mentioned an Andrew Witherby, pardon my spelling if I got these things wrong, and a James Windbags. So there's 2 of the 3 people killed. He also mentioned a Captain Ramsey. So that's going to be interesting, potentially. So we could hit up these names in our directory, but before we do that, maybe we should go speak to Captain Ramsey, because while I trust everything the Stride tells us, maybe we should hear from Captain Ramsey what he really had to say about the whole situation. Ramsey? Ah, Herman Ramsey. That must be him. After pursuing the Times, Holmes is convinced Mr. Ramsey has information valuable to the case. He gathers his coat and hat and catches a carriage to the home of the man.
We had just come through a rather grueling storm, so I sent my first officer, Luther Tenney, down into the hold to check on the condition of the cargo. He reported back post-haste that Mr. Weatherby was lying dead among the Egyptian artifacts we were transporting. I turned over the helm to Tenney and went below to have a look for myself.
And did what you see confirm Teddy's report?
Unfortunately, yes. Weatherby was lying next to that coffin, or whatever it's called, apparently strangled. I went back to the bridge and put Tenney in charge of the investigation.
And what did he uncover?
Well, you'll have to ask him for the specifics, because I can scarcely recall the details.
How about that, everybody? Our boy there, Herman Ramsey, was actually really informative. So he's a captain of a ship that was returning to England or wherever. James Windbag was on board, dead in the hold amongst all the Egyptian artifacts. He had been strangled. Now we have a method of death, location of death. Amazing! We also got the name of Luther Tenney, a sailor on board who discovered the body, and he's recommended we go talk to him to get some finer details about that incident. So I'm thinking that's what we do next. Luther Tenney, let's do this! Watson hails a handsome cab and Holmes follows his friend. On their way to Tenney's address, Holmes shares his thoughts with the good doctor on the case thus far.
Let me tell you, a murder, even by a 4,000-year-old mummy, was only one odd thing in a string of bad luck on this voyage.
What sort of bad luck?
It all started with the crew, really. Seamen are a rather superstitious lot to begin with, and the idea carrying about a 4,000-year-old mummy had them shivering in their timbers. We almost faced a bloody mutiny. In there were the passengers, a strange lot. I can tell you that reporter fellow, Travis, did us no service at all with his mystic mumbo-jumbo. He and Professor Winterbank had a regular war of words going on about whatever powers this mummy was supposed to have. And there was the 2 Arabs.
Arabs? Interesting. Do you recall their names?
I should hope I do. One was called Farmy. He always carried around this curious little box. No clue what was in it, but Farmy never let it out of his sight. The other one's name was Al Sard, and he spent most of his time lurking about watching Farmy. My guess is he wanted that box.
Sounds like you had your hands full.
I haven't even told you about the fight yet between Mr. Weatherby and Mr. Urubaru.
Over what?
Weatherby's wife, I'd say, though they were a tight-lipped lot about it.
I see. Tell me, Lieutenant, we understand that you were the first person to discover the body.
Yes, sir, I was. Captain Ramsey sent me down to inspect the hold. I went immediately over to them Egyptian crates. Professor Winterbank was particularly anxious about him, you know.
Could you describe the scene as you remember it?
I'll never forget it. I just made my way to the back of the hold, and I noticed at the top of them crates, the one what carried the mummy's coffin was raised up kind of funny like. The coffin lid was laid off to one side, and there was Mr. Weatherby all sprawled on the floor next to a bowl of ashes. He'd been strangled by a length of the mummy's sheeting. Bloody gruesome, I tell you. Poor bloke's eyes popped out like a couple of sausages on a hot iron skillet.
Quite a vivid picture, don't you agree, Holmes?
Quite. And you reported this to Captain Ramsey straight away?
Absolutely. In fact, the captain put me in charge of the entire investigation.
And what did you discover? Did anybody have any contact with Weatherby on the night of the murder?
Not that I know of. I could account for all the crew. And the passengers were in their cabins as far as anyone knew or would say. Nobody saw anything, heard anything, or knew anything. Besides, Weatherby was seasick from the beginning. He stayed pretty much in his cabin all the time. Maybe that's why the lovely young Mrs. Weatherby was gallivanting about.
With Uruburu?
Yes, indeed.
And what of the bowl? Where is it now?
The bowl?
With the ashes?
Oh, yes. You know, now that you mention it, I don't recall ever seeing it again.
Uh-oh! Right, we got a lot of information out of that. We really did. So, he saw an awful lot. There's a lot of detailing here. So we learnt from the voyage that the crew was spooked because there's a mummy on board, they're superstitious. It resulted in a near mutiny. On top of that, the passengers were arguing with each other, Weatherby and Uruburu fighting each other. Travis, the reporter, was also on board. Wasn't helping things because he was stirring up the spookiness of the mummy being there. You noted how there's two Arabs on board, a Fahmy and a Al-Assad. Al-Assad was always watching Fahmy, and Fahmy was carrying a box that he never let out of his sight. Mr. Weatherby, who was fighting Uruburu, was traveling with his wife, who was always gallivanting on deck with Mr. Uruburu, weirdly enough. And Mr. Weatherby himself was feeling very seasick for the majority of the journey and stayed to his cabin. It was Andrew Weatherby who was found dead in the hold of that ship by the Egyptian mummy. The dead body had been strangled by the tarps of the mummy itself, his eyes bulging outwards. And next to his head, a bowl of ashes, which has now gone missing. Not a pretty sight by any means, but it's on a boat. Hooray! So we've got a nice timeline there. On board in cabin, has a fight, somehow appears in the hold, dead by the artifacts. Also on board was another victim, we don't know how he died yet, but James Windybank. He was on board the same ship, and he had a daily argument with the reporter from the Times, Philip Travis, regarding the mummy's power. So we haven't spoken to Philip yet, so that's something we gotta do. I mean, we gotta talk to Mrs. Weatherby, because we gotta know what happened there with the Uruburu fight. We gotta speak to Fahmy and Mr. Uruburu if we can track them down. Here we go, Philip Travis! Holmes decides to travel to Mr. Travis's home alone, leaving Watson in the company of Mrs. Hudson and her apple cranberry cakes.
So you've been reading my articles in the Times. I'm honored. What do you think of them?
Quite interesting. You've clearly been following the murders quite closely. Who do you suspect?
I believe it is the work of the ancient Egyptian god Pumatef and his goddess Neith.
Be serious.
I couldn't be more serious. You see, Mr. Holmes, although I am a journalist, I was actually trained as an Egyptologist. I know all about these mysteries. That's why my articles carry the force of truth.
And what is the truth, Mr. Travis?
The truth is that the Egyptians discovered the secret of life. What we call science is mere child's play compared to the knowledge they had. Look at this. Do you know what this is?
Appears to be a mummified animal of some sort. A monkey, perhaps?
Precisely.
Quite a conversation piece.
I've been using it in some very important experiments which, if successful, will unlock the secret to bringing back the souls of the dead. I've been working on it, Mr. Holmes, using these tanner leaves. Watch. Uma lotus. Licantina. Burura.
Amazing! His
The
face!
soul of this particular monkey has no intention of making a reappearance.
It's only a matter of time. I know it is. After all, these secrets have been buried for thousands of years. These things don't happen overnight. But it will happen someday. This is my mission.
I believe I'll leave you to your work, Mr. Travis.
And don't go yet. Let me show you more.
Thank you. Some other time, perhaps.
Please, be my friend. No one likes me. They think I'm weird. Do you want to play with my dead monkey? It'll come to life eventually. Give it time. It's been 1,000 or so years. Please! So we didn't get much out of him apart from him being mental, but he did mention the name of the Egyptian mummy he believes is behind this, and that was a Tumotef. He also mentioned a lesser god, but I didn't catch its name. I might rewatch that video, get another name out of it. Besides that, we didn't really ask him any hard-hitting questions. We didn't ask him why he had an argument with James Windybank about the mummy. Although now we've met him, I can kind of put two and two together why they had fights. We have quite the case notes building up right now. We've got a lot of backstory to all of these individuals. People we have yet to speak to, Mrs. Weatherby, Fahmy, and Uruburu. And then we're kind of out of leads after that. Apart from maybe checking on the homes of James Windybank and Andrew Weatherby. We still don't know where James Windybank died or how he died. But let's go for Mrs. Weatherby. Let's get that out the way. A Clarissa. Ooh! Weatherby, Watson asks as Holmes reaches for his deerstalker hat. The great detective reminds the good doctor of the article in the paper and the unfortunate demise of Andrew Weatherby.
I'm very sorry to intrude on you in your moment of grief.
Oh, that's quite all right. You know, Andrew and I hadn't been married very long.
Long enough to know if he had any enemies?
Oh, Andrew was so unassuming. Everyone liked him.
Including Mr. Uruburu?
I really loved my husband.
I'm sure you did. Oh, English toffee. My favorite.
Would you like one?
Please.
Sorry, you'll have to open this yourself. I've never been any good with these things.
Ah, so we didn't really learn much from her at all, apart from she's so weak she can't open a box of toffees, and that her husband was well liked by many people. They were not married for very long, and she did indeed love him. Right, well, thank you for your time, Clarissa. You're welcome. Let's go speak to Mr. Uruburu. The good doctor receives a telegram summoning him to the home of one of his patients. Holmes hails a carriage and proceeds to Mr. Uruburu's home in hopes of a clue or two.
If this is an inconvenient time, perhaps I could come back, Mr. Uruburu.
Wouldn't hear of it. Just a bit of a hangover. I've weathered plenty worse than this.
I'm investigating the death of Andrew Weatherby. You were on the ship with him out of Cairo. Did you happen to make his acquaintance?
Weatherby, a most tedious fellow.
So tedious, one might want to do him in.
Don't be preposterous. In my condition, I couldn't have done anything of the sort.
What condition was that?
And I thought you were a great detective. The first night out, a few of us threw a bit of a bash that went on until we docked in London.
Did Mrs. Weatherby attend this particular bash?
She was the guest of honor, you might say.
Ooh-wee! Holmes did not seem pleased as he said the word bash. Okay, well, this is interesting. So, Anthony Uruburu, he claims he was pretty much drunk the entire voyage in a bash that lasted the whole length of the voyage, and therefore was indisposed and could not possibly have murdered Andrew Weatherby. But he did also comment that Andrew was a most tedious fellow. How could he come to that conclusion if Andrew was kind of confined to his cabin with seasickness until the point of having a confrontation with him? Something he kind of skirted under the carpet with. He didn't mention having the fight. He also alluded that his wife was the guest of honor. If I read between the lines there, I think they kind of suggested she was... I don't know. I don't want to say it. Right, well, next up, let's go to speak to Fami. Akram Fami. Here we go. A mist seems to rise from the Thames as the men cross a bridge on their way to meet Akram Fami, a handler of historical relics.
Hello? Is anyone there? Mr. Fami, are you?
Dear God, he's dead!
Apparently so, Watson. Look.
Oh, what ghastly business. Everyone will assume the mummy has struck again.
Hardly a plausible assumption. This poor fellow has a knife in his back and not a scrap of sheeting about his neck.
How very observant, Holmes.
Ring up Scotland Yard. This case is simple enough for them to solve.
You've solved it already.
Elementary, my dear Watson. Obviously, it was the butler.
Butler? What butler?
Exactly my point. A man as wealthy as Akram Fami would always have a manservant about him. After the foul deed, this one obviously beat a hasty retreat.
That's Sherlock! So Akram Fami has now been bumped up the list from the people section to the victim section. Ta-da! Found dead in his home by Sherlock and Watson with a knife in his back and no sign of his manservant. Highly suspicious for a wealthy and well-to-do person such as himself. Sherlock wanted us to contact Lestrade because it was simple enough for him to take care of. I suggest we do exactly that. We've already seen this cutscene. Right, well, thank you, Lestrade, for being absolutely useless! So we don't know how James Windibank has died. There was no witnesses, no motive. All we know is that he was on board that ship with Andrew Weatherby. We know how Andrew Weatherby died, we know his wife, we knew more or less his movements on board. Thinking about it, we should get the crew manifest from the captain because the killer was one of the ship's people. Has to be one of them. This doesn't look so good for Travis. Right, before we hit the newspapers, let's go to whatever remains of James Windibank's address. Here he is, hop up. Armed with information he has discovered both in the Times and conversations with reliable sources, Holmes sets out alone in hopes of a revolutionary conversation with Windibank's widow.
James was so thrilled when Dr. Turnbull invited him to join the expedition. He felt he had spent his entire life reading books about archaeology, and now was finally getting an opportunity to go out into the field.
Tell me, Mrs. Windibank, when your husband returned, did he discuss the deaths of his colleagues?
Of course. James was extremely upset. I know he did not believe a curse to be responsible. My husband was a man of science.
How about that? Science! So he made it home alive, and we've got a name, a Dr. Turnbilly, something like that. James was upset about the death of Andrew Weatherby. He didn't believe in the mummy's curse. He was a man of science. So this is why James and Travis were arguing, because Travis is all about the power of the mummy. James is like, mate, it's science, okay? None of this mumbo-jumbo, it's science. Dr. Ebenezer Turnbull, come on down! Ironically, the doctor isn't feeling well, so Holmes decides to pay a visit to the home of the late Ebenezer Turnbull by himself. The late? So he's dead? So we've got 3 murders that are related directly to this mummy, and a 4th murder, which is, what, secondary?
Dr. Turnbull, he was a strange one, he was. All he ever at home, always traipsing about to Lord knows where.
May I take a look at his things?
Oh, suit yourself. All he had is a big pile of books about Egyptian mummies and a few maps. He was a son of an earl, he was. Though you hardly tell from looking at him, poor fellow. Do you really think this mummy thing's what's done him in? Creepy, I says.
Creepy asses! So he's the son of an earl. He has nothing really to his name apart from books and maps. We might have to go to the newspapers to get our next bit of cluing. Because all we know for certain is that people have died, but we don't really have any definitive proof of how they died or who killed them or whatever. I got a contact from Mrs. Hudson. Oh, adorable. Okay, I can't find anything with Earl written on it in here, so that's a no-go for now. But there's nothing for it. Newspapers it is. Right, starting at the bottom, we're going to work our way up. In the nature of saving time, I'll pull you in if I find anything, otherwise we'll just crack to the next bit of the video. Recent excavations in Egypt. It speaks about Dr. Turnbull, James, and Andrew giving a joint lecture about a new discovery in Egypt ahead of their trip out to Cairo to do the expedition. They talk about profitable ways in order to conduct an expedition like this. Well, that's that one. Archaeologist dead in mummy's tomb. Professor Turnbull, organizer of the Katebet tomb expedition, was found dead in the tomb early this morning. The inner chamber was reached early in the year after much difficult labor, and the archaeologists were quite ecstatic over the excellent condition of the sarcophagus, blah blah blah. Sarcophagus. Why can't I say sarcophagus? Why can't I say sarcophagus? Of the mummy's coffin. The party was in the final weeks of its work in the area when disaster struck. Mr. Turnbull had worked late into the night, remaining in the chamber alone after another member of the party had retired for the night. His body was discovered by Mr. Andrew Weatherby, another of the project archaeologists. Mr. Turnbull had been strangled to death. Ancient linen bandages were found around his neck. Upon hearing of the professor's death, several of the natives working on the excavation called upon Isis and Osiris for protection and for forgiveness for disturbing the sacred tomb. Inscriptions found on the canopic jars and doors indicate that his death may be the mysterious work of the ancient god Thompson and his goddess Neith. Right, we have a cause of death, and it's the same death that Andrew would go on to face on the return home to England from Cairo. So how did James die? Is it going to be by strangulation? And finally, Mummy strikes again! The body of James Windibank was discovered late yesterday in the room he was preparing for the British Museum's exhibit of newly discovered artifacts from the team of Kateb's mummy. The archaeologist was found strangled. Around his neck were linen bandages of the type used by the ancient Egyptians in wrapping mummies. Windibank's is the 3rd murder to be associated with the mummy Kateb in the past 6 weeks. The archaeologist had accompanied the London University-sponsored expedition to Egypt. The project has been cursed with ill luck since the first discovery of the tomb several months ago. Its organizer, Dr. Turnbull, was murdered in the actual tomb itself in early March. Another archaeologist, Andrew Weatherby, met a similar fate on board the ship returning to England just last week. The Jardine ship Eastern Empress was the scene of that mysterious death. The shipboard investigation was handled by Captain Herman Ramsey and his first officer, Luther Tenney. Scotland Yard has declined to name any suspects at this time, because he knows nothing. But this is great, the Jardine ship Eastern Empress. So now we have the name of the shipping company. That's helpful. So too long didn't listen. He died in the British Museum while setting up the exhibition to display the artifacts they had returned from the Valley of the Kings, whatever. So whoever did the little bit of murder in Egypt, did a little bit more murder on board the ship, has returned to England with them to do a little bit of murder. Can you think of somebody who was there and is also now here? Somebody who's very interested in Egyptian artifacts and mumbo jumbo. Yeah, I'm pretty sure the reporter has done this, but what could his motive be? Shipping lines. Let's go there first. Jardine, Maintine & Co. Let's do this! After reading an article in the Times, Holmes hurries Watson into a carriage, believing that time is of the essence as they head over to the shipping company.
Here is a passenger list you requested, sir.
Oh, thanks. That's all we're getting. Right, let me watch that again and write down some of those names. Okay, so the passenger list. There isn't too many passengers on board, which is fortunate for us. We have Abdullah Al-Sad, Akram Fahmy, Louise Fenwick, Phillips Travis, Anthony Uruburu, Andrew Weatherby, Clarissa Weatherby, and James Winterbank. Of those, we know James is dead, Andrew is dead, Clarissa is a widow, Anthony Uruburu is apparently a drunkard, Philip Travis is the reporter, Akru Fahmy has been found dead at his office. So we're left with two names that I'm not familiar with, this Louis Fenwick and Abdullah Al-Sad. I do vaguely remember hearing the Al-Sad bit, but I may have overlooked it in my notes. So I guess we're going to go check those people out, see what their story is. Abdullah Al-Sad. Holmes knows nothing of Al-Sad and is eager to accompany Watson to his home. Perhaps the gentleman could be of service to them.
Well, Holmes, I checked in with Mr. Al-Sad's manservant and...
And you discovered that Mr. Al-Sad was not at home.
But however did you know that?
Elementary, my dear Watson. I noticed some crumpet crumbs from the corner bakery stuck to your lapel. You haven't been gone long enough to stop for tea and interview anyone at length.
Most observant, sir.
Well, that wasn't helpful at all, was it? He's not home. Okay, well, Louise Fenwick, let's have a chat with you. Where are you? Cap in hand, the men leave 221B Baker Street and journey to the other side of town to visit the haughty Fenwicks. They hope for a tidbit of information.
I'm sorry, but I don't know anything about the death of old... whatever his name was.
Andrew Weatherby.
Fact is, I only saw the gentleman once, just as we were boarding. And I'll tell you, I resented the first officer's questioning us on the matter, and I resent yours.
The whole voyage was a disaster from beginning to end. Our accommodations were positively abysmal. They wouldn't even let us bring Dickie into our cabin.
Dickie? Her high-strung, distasteful little mutt.
How can you say that, Merrill? You know Dickie is a blue-blooded Yorkshire Terrier. Mumsy will be with you in just a moment, Dickiekins. He's a bit under the weather, you know. That's why we were only able to stay in Egypt for 2 weeks. Dickie was so disappointed. He so wanted to see the Sphinx.
Mr. Holmes is not interested in your incessant whining, Louise.
Oh, now I whine, do I? There was a time you thought I had a lovely speaking voice. It's true, Mr. Holmes. He once adored me.
No doubt.
Oh, for the love of God, Louise, spare us your blubbering.
I love how Holmes just doesn't feel at all comfortable around a crying woman. Like, oh no, what do I do? What do I'm leaving? Goodbye. I'll investigate you later. Goodbye. Interesting. I'm just looking at my clue history, and that part about Dr. Turnbull being an Earl's son, we couldn't find the name. But I didn't read this, and this says that Turnbull was the Earl of Downey. So I suppose we have another lead. I suppose. Oh, well, scratch that. I can't find like a Downey in the book, and there's nothing under Earl, E for Earl. So, yeah, we can't visit him. Let's see if we can take this to the judge. If we can, I will explain my theory. Here we go. Armed with information about the mummy's murders, the detectives cut a swath through the London fog and head to the Queen's Court.
I'm sorry, gentlemen, but it seems you will have to turn up a clue or two more before I'll judge this case.
Fine, I'll do exactly that. Okay, well, I'm kind of at a dead end. So, Watson. Oh, no, the clue system sucks in this game. Watson's going to give me every clue in sequence until we get to where we are at. So, in terms of a score, Just ignore it. We're here for the story, not for a high score. Oh, I forgot. The British Museum. We didn't go to the British Museum yet. Oh, yes! British Museum, here we go. Holmes logically concludes that the clues in this case point to visiting the museum. Watson heartily agrees and follows the detective out of the door.
Windibank's body was found in the mummy's case.
Inside it?
Precisely. One of the guards, Henry Witherspoon, discovered it when making his rounds. He noticed that the lid was askew and a hand was sticking out of it. By the look on his face when he came to summons me, he must have thought that the mummy was attempting to leave its resting place. Some of the guards have been a bit on edge, you know, since the stories about Dr. Turnbull's death.
What happened when you arrived at the scene?
Witherspoon assisted me in removing the lid, and there was the body of James Windibank. Around his neck was a bandage of linen.
And the mummy was missing?
No, it was in there too. Underneath poor Windibank, completely undisturbed, not a length of its sheeting unraveled.
Who had access to the exhibit room?
Well, the room was officially closed yesterday while we set up the exhibit, but the museum was open and we took no extraordinary precautions to keep people out.
Can you think of anyone who might have wanted to kill Windibank?
None at all. I actually didn't know him very well. He did work for the museum, you see. He was with the London University. The university and the museum were joint sponsors of the Ketterbeck expedition.
Mr. Johnson, can you think of anything whatsoever that might shed some light on this affair?
No. I'm very sorry. I can't think of a thing. I only hope that all this publicity doesn't keep people away from the exhibit.
Okay, that was interesting stuff. So the mummy was undisturbed inside the sarcophagus. I said the word. The mummy was undisturbed. Not a single bit of its linen had been taken or cut. So whoever's doing these strangulations has their own supply of ancient Egypt linen. Something that Travis Phillips guy most probably has access to, considering he's got Egyptified mummies of monkeys. He's got monkeys in his room. Right, he was discovered by the guard, whose name was Henry Witherspoon. Interesting, we'll speak to him in a moment, but also he made point to mention that James didn't work for the British Museum. He was from the London University, and it was a joint venture between them and the British Museum that funded this whole Ketterbeck expedition shanbangan-dagadang. So we got to go talk to the university as well to get some background about him. So first up, let's do Henry Witherspoon. His name isn't in the book. How peculiar. You'd think the person who found the body is a person of interest to speak to, but is not in the game. Well, that said, let's go to let's go to the University of London. London University. Watson states the obvious when he recommends a trip to the Egyptology department is in order. Holmes commends the good doctor and ushers him out the door into the fading sunlight.
Such a tragedy. Fine men all and such outstanding scholars. I still can't quite get over the shock of it.
We understand.
Professor, we're looking for background information on these three men so that we can understand how their murders might tie together.
Well, let me begin with Dr. Turnbull. Ebenezer Turnbull was responsible for organizing the Ketterbeck expedition. Quite a remarkable man, really. This was the first time he teamed up with James Windibank. Professor Windibank was one of our most popular lecturers. In fact, several of his former students were also eager to accompany him. I recall him saying that he was having difficulty choosing. Weatherby turned out to be the lucky one. Though it seems far from it now, doesn't it? I suppose Smith and Travis turned out to be the lucky ones after all.
Smith and Travis?
Peter Smith accepted the invitation to join another expedition. As for Philip Travis, he was quite keen on accompanying Professor Windibank. In fact, he became exceedingly upset when Andrew Weatherby, a postgraduate student in the department, was chosen instead. Took it rather personally, I should say.
And that right there is the nail in the sarcophagus Egyptian coffin. Travis, an educated archaeologist, was snubbed. He didn't get picked for the expedition of his life. So what does he do? He follows them in the guise of a journalist, raged by greed and, not greed, but envy and taking it all a bit to heart. He murders them one by one. If I can't join you on this case, and no one gets this case kind of thing. As for the other guy, the Smith guy, I don't think he's relevant because he went on another job. He's nowhere involved. He left. Like, he's not here. Stab in the dark. What does Peter Smith have to say about this?
Sorry I can't help you, Ducky. but Mr. Smith has been out of the country since the middle of March. He's a good-looking bloke, except for the dirt under his fingernails.
Oh, Sherlock, he does not know how to interact with the females, does he? No, he does not. Right, that rules Peter Smith out of the equation. He's been gone since March. So, I believe we have a case, everybody. We have the motive, we have the person, we have the places. Let me explain this entire story out to you. Philip Travis, an oddball, eccentric kind of guy who has a raging hard-on for Egyptian mummies and bringing their souls back to the world of the living. Having studied archaeology at the London University, he was very excited to join Dr. Turnbull on this expedition to Cairo to exhume the tomb of the Egyptian goddess Kate Bet. However, he was not picked to go. Undergraduate student Andrew Weatherby was picked instead. He was not pleased about this at all. And in addition to Dr. Turnbull and Andrew Weatherby, we have popular lecturer at the university, James Windybank, who'll be going on his very first major expedition. This was a big deal in the newspapers. Just a week before leaving, they gave a big presentation to the press explaining what they're going to be doing and all of that jazz. This was critical information for Philip Travis. It was through this lecture that he discovered the mythology of how they're going to be conducting their scene, their dig, their expedition. Armed with his knowledge of Egypt and archaeology, he got a job at the Times as a reporter and assigned himself to this dig. Joining him on the ship, he went out to Cairo and waited to strike. As darkness fell and the crew left one by one, leaving Dr. Turnbull alone inside the tomb of Kate Teb, he let himself in and did him over. Having grabbed some ancient linen from the area or even brought his own from home, he strangled and killed the doctor. Fast forward to the return voyage to Blighty, and he's on board the same ship as the entire crew. And that's where he kills Andrew Weatherby. I'm unsure what got Andrew to go down to the hold to check on the artifacts, but some way or another, he was down there. And that's all Philip needed to strike, strangling the man so hard his eyes popped out their sockets. So now, back in London with the expedition leads dead and the guy who got the job rather than him dead, the time had come to wrap up loose ends. After all, these are murders and he's going to be a suspect at some point, so he takes out the remaining archaeologist at the British Museum as he's setting up for the exhibition. James Windybank did nothing wrong. He was innocent in all of this. He was excited to be going. Tragically for him, it ended in his own death. But that was not the end of things. You see, Philip Travis, he's an eccentric fellow oddball that has his own private collection of Egyptology things, conducting seances, practices, whatever. He's experimenting on mummified monkeys to try and bring their souls back from the dead. Where's he going to obtain such things from? From the local artifact dealer, who just so happened to be on board the ship returning from Cairo with them. And what happened? He died. Hi, Future Spammals here. I think I made a bit of a mistake on this final note about the whole story. So, Travis didn't kill the artifact dealer. You may remember on board the ship, the steward made points to mention how this other passenger called Al Suad or something like that kept his eyes on him at all times, and that the collector always carried a box on his person that he refused to let go. I assume once the ship docked back in London, Al-Saad followed him back to his home and then killed him and took the box. When we saw the body, there was no sign of a box. So that murder really is unrelated and is, if anything, a distraction to the main murder. Ta-da! Right, back to old Spammals. The entire archaeological team dead. Vengeance has been sought. Right, that is my case. That is my story. I'm taking it to the judge.
Hear ye, hear ye.
Yes! Right, it's time.
Queen's Court now stands in order.
Yes, it does, Your Honor. Sherlock Holmes, mighty detective here. Right, let me explain this one to you, okay?
Mr. Holmes, I understand you've been looking into the mummy murders.
Yes, my lord.
Tell me then, who was Ebenezer Turnbull's murderer?
I'm so glad you asked, Your Honor, for it was Philip Travis!
And what makes you so certain? What was Travis' motive for killing Turnbull?
Oh, the motive! It's so simple, Your Honor. None of these things on the screen are what I want to say. I would imagine Dr. Turnbull didn't pick to bring him on the expedition because of his oddball nature and his eccentricness. So maybe he also tried to prevent him coming on location as a journalist for the same reason. He doesn't want him anywhere near him. He's an idiot.
Positively incorrect. I'm afraid you haven't done a good enough job of putting your brains to the task.
That was the wrong answer. Can I try again? The motive was Turnbull publicly lambasted Travis for questioning his credentials, Your Honor.
And what of Andrew Weatherby? Who murdered him?
I'm so glad you asked, for it was Philip Travis again!
So, you say Travis killed Turnbull and Weatherby?
Yes, Your Honor.
My lord.
But what was his motive to kill Weatherby, Mr. Holmes?
I am so glad you asked. Travis was angry that Weatherby was chosen for the exhibition instead of himself. Correct.
Revenge. The oldest motive in the book. Now, Mr. Holmes, who killed James Windibank?
Brace yourself, okay? It's going to be mind-blowing. You're never going to see this one coming. Who killed him? Philip Travis did!
This Travis seems to be quite a busy fellow. What made him kill James Windibank?
Well, this is the icing on the cake, Your Honor. This is the decoration that makes everyone's jaw drop. Oh, it was Windibank who did not choose him for the expedition. Oh, but I thought, okay, well, I guess that's the right one.
Well, you've done an admirable job in resolving this mystery. I'd say you're on a par with just about any other armchair detective out there. I would suggest, however, that you rethink this case again, thereby improving your sleuthing skills.
Does that mean it's not the best answer? Because that's what he said in the last episode.
We must be slipping, my dear Holmes. But in any event, I'm breathing easier. At least we got our men.
Oh, I think he says that because of our score being 230, where Holmes' score is only 35. No. We got it all correct. We did it. We got it right, everybody. Congratulations. We are done. But what has Holmes got to say about everything?
Well, Watson, I believe this case is solved. And for your information, it was not the mummy.
Come, Holmes. I never thought for a moment it was the mummy.
Of course not, Watson. However, the murderer and the mummy did have one thing in common.
What's that?
They both were the only ones present at the time of the murders, except, of course, the victims.
You state the obvious, Holmes.
Ah, but it is seeing the obvious that is important. First, I saw no reason to assume that we were dealing with more than one murderer. Secondly, the locations of the murders limited the number of suspects.
Limited them? The first murder was in Egypt, the second on ship in the middle of the sea, and the third in London. You call the entire populations of London and Egypt a limited number of suspects?
No, Watson. We had to find someone who was in Egypt for the first murder, on the ship for the second, and in London for the third.
Oh, but of course.
According to the newspapers, the Eastern Empress was in Bombay at the time of Ebenezer Turnbull's murder, so that eliminated the ship's crew as suspects. Thus, I needed the list of passengers who boarded the ship at Cairo. It was our visit to Jardine, Mason and Company that provided our first critical clue. From it, I learned that Philip Travis was a passenger. I then learned that Travis was the chap who reported on the first murder. He became one suspect, but I had no motive. Clarissa Weatherby, who was also at the scene of the murder in Cairo, was another possible suspect, since she appears to have had a bit of a dalliance with Mr. Uruburu there on the high seas. So I had found her motive for the murder of Weatherby, but not a motive for the murder of the others.
Then whom did you eliminate?
Mrs. Weatherby. Her hands were not strong enough even to open a jar of English toffee, let alone strangle a grown man.
And what of Travis's motive?
It seems that Travis was a student in the Egyptology department at London University and had studied under James Windibank. He wanted very badly to be chosen as a member of the expedition, but Windibank turned him down. Instead, Weatherby was chosen and Travis was furious. So there you have the motive for two of the murders.
And what of his motive for the murder of Turnbull?
Evidently, Travis had written a vicious article questioning Dr. Turnbull's credentials to lead the expedition. Turnbull's response was quite harsh. Probably powerful enough to drive an odd duck like Travis to murder.
Very impressive, Holmes.
Elementary, my dear Watson.
Elementary, my dear Watson. Well, there you have it. The case, as they would say, is over. It's closed. It's the end. That was a really fun investigation. I really enjoyed this one. It was really interesting. Like, it had 3 different locations: Egypt, ship, and London. I loved interviewing everybody. I loved trying to piece it all together. I don't want to trip my own horn, but we did totally get this one. We totally nailed this one. It seemed logical to me that whoever did these 3 murders has to be in all 3 locations, and you can refine that down to the passenger list of a ship. And that was one small passenger list. The case of the mummy's curse is solved. A murderer's behind bars. Widows now have someone to hate. And with that, the episode has come to an end. What did you think of this mystery? Did you have it all sussed, or was you left wondering what the hell is going on? The acting is delightfully terrible. I'm loving it. I really am. Boulder Dash. Anyway, on that bombshell, thank you for watching. Rate, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you in the next episode. Goodbye, everybody.